Welcome back to das Symposium von Die Gemeinschaft. Everyone, hello, welcome back from Jason's talk that we had before. Nice to see you here again. Now, and tonight we have Krishnendu Ray with us. Hi, Krishnendu, maybe you can say, can wave real quick.
Yes, hi everyone. Lovely to see you here.
So we're speaking with him about globalization and the central role of food in the construction of identity. Krishnendu is, first of all, the Department Chair of Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU, and is also an author of the Migrant's Table and the Ethnic Restaurateur, two books that we will also put into our resource lists that you will all get afterwards in the event app that we have. So everything that we're talking about and additional resources, such as papers that you wrote or books or podcasts, we will all share afterwards so you can dive deeper into the topics. Tonight that it will work in a way that Krishnendu gives us a short input. And then, as usual, we will go into a small Q&A so you can ask your questions afterwards. So yeah, I'll give directly the imaginary microphone to you.
Hey, thanks a lot. Hey, thanks a lot, Frida. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to speak for about half an hour, and we will have questions and discussion as long as you want. So I'm going to set the timer for myself so I know I get a warning. I'm going to share my screen. It's a PowerPoint, and that will be shared with you if you want the PowerPoint later. Okay, you can get it. It's good. Anna, can I see you smile? So I know I'm saying you can hear me. Good, perfect. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint here. Let's see this one. Okay. Okay, good. I can see you, so it's kind of doesn't get disoriented. So it's called Food Culture and Migration. I'm going to show you some data, and some of it's going to be very preliminary, fun data. Some of it is going to be kind of thick and intense. And I'm also going to hypothesize certain kinds of patterns and theory about food and migration. And I'm going to talk about two aspects. One is about home cooking, immigrant home cooking. The other is about public culture. So in a sense, if you are an immigrant, you will see some of the aspects of it. And if you are a consumer of immigrant food and public culture, my work is primarily based in the US, though today I will show some preliminary data on Berlin that I looked at Yelp just in preparing for this talk. Okay, and overall, I would say I'm talking about two things today. One is the dialectic of tradition and innovation in immigrant foodways, specifically in the US, and you tell me whether it works or does not work in the context of Germany or elsewhere, wherever you are, because this is an international symposium. The second aspect, the big picture aspect, is I'm talking about immigrant lives, and especially notions of livelihoods and liveliness of urban cultures. If you are in a city today, it is likely, highly likely, that there are immigrants, international or intranational immigrants from the countryside, from the small towns to the big cities, and they shape urban culinary cultures in very interesting ways. So quickly, I'm going to immerse you in this kind of an ethnographic work that is drawn from one of my books. It is about a certain group of migrants. And I asked them, do meals matter? And they gave me a complicated answer. They said, yeah, meals matter, but you see, they don't matter as much as, say, if my child were to change their religion, I would feel like a dramatic loss of culture. Meals events are more like attire. I hope they wear some traditional attire. I hope they eat some kind of my cultural food, my children. But since at least there are 3 food events a day, if not more, it doesn't feel like as much of a threat to the loss of culture about being in the world. One of the things that dramatically changes are breakfast and lunches. In my case, of 126 households, it gets quickly Americanized. And by Americanized, I mean that it becomes toast and eggs and breakfast cereals. And that is mostly, I think, related to, I'll move this out of the way so I can see my own slide. Related to basically, there's no domestic help for a lot of these immigrants, middle-class immigrants that I studied, and especially female labor force participation is high, commutes are long, so the marginal utility of time in the morning is the 5 minutes or the 10 minutes or the 15 minutes is very important. And there's also a cultural sense, the sense that these immigrants in the US think about breakfast as opening the door to a public world. So they kind of brace themselves to enter this public world. But one thing does not change, and that is they don't become coffee drinkers from tea drinkers coming from India, and which is kind of interesting because it points to some things that may be nutritionally marginal, but psychotropic substances like tea and coffee to a habituated body. For me, it was kind of an interesting revelation about this importance of biosociality, something that is physiological and psychological, and we're going to come back to talk about it. In contrast to breakfast and lunch, dinner changes acutely and dramatically. And there's a sense of, in some ways, being in the world. And just as with breakfast, there was a sense of you open the door to a public American world. Here, there's a sense of, this is mostly Bengali Americans that I interviewed, shut the door behind them to keep American culture at bay. But not everyone in the household was equally invested in this kind of a traditional culture. Interestingly and surprisingly, there's a gender and a generational difference. And what is surprising was this: married men with children were the most conservative in their hunger for traditional food, but not married women with children. They were, in fact, most innovative because they were part of my, and here's a bit of my theorization. Part of it is because they are feeding their children are American born, they want American food, and these women are also cooking. Women are, 99% of my respondents, female respondents, were cooking, while 99% of my male respondents were not cooking, but just thinking about culture. Thinking about culture in a transcendental capital C way demands a certain kind of action and behavior, while the women were acting much more pragmatically and less in terms of grandiose thinking about culture, and also mediating their children's need. So overall, I would say, importantly, there's a mix of hybridity, innovation, and tradition, which I think is a lovely way of negotiating a mobile body and material culture. See, this is almost, think about it as almost the opposite of the great European concept of terroir. My work is basically on routes of mobility and material culture, in this case, particularly food culture. And I think this makes immigrants quintessentially modern subjects, not overly traditional, not overly innovative, but some kind of a mix of the two. So this is kind of quickly getting you into the space. But now I'm going to step back a little just to kind of inform you about the role of immigrants. What scale are we talking about in terms of the contemporary American food system? A couple of things to keep in mind. Some of this is replicated in other parts of the world, but North America is a particularly important destination for migrants everywhere in the world. Just to give you a sense, there are about only 1 million hired farm workers in the US in about 2 million farms, which are very large farms, but 73% of the farm workers are foreign born. Okay. There are restaurants, and I'm going to talk a little about it, from 800,000 to maybe 500,000. Of course, all those restaurants are in catastrophic crisis right now. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it. Restaurants have about 15 million workers, and about 22% of them are foreign born. But if you're in a place like New York City, almost all restaurant labor is foreign born. And some of you may have heard about meatpacking factories which in fact had high rates of COVID-19 recently, and about 40% of the labor in the meatpacking industry is foreign-born. Recently, a report pointed out that 37% of small restaurant owners are immigrants in the US. And US tends to be the highest, some of the highest in the world, with some exceptions. The important point here, the visual here on the right side, is that this pattern is not new. This is data from the cusp of the Civil War, 1860. And if you look at bakers, butchers, restaurant keepers, what else? Brewers and maltsters. These are, by the way, all census categories. 100% of them sometimes in New York City were foreign born, and in other parts of the country, often 50, 60% foreign born, compared to a population that has hovered around 14% foreign born. So foreign born or immigrant are overrepresented in food at public food business. And by the way, an interesting note is in 1860, most of these foreign born were not Chinese, were not, some of them were Chinese, but not most of them. Most of them were in fact Germans and Irish. They were part of, and that's what has changed. The immigrant percentage remains the same. The source of immigration has changed. And this is the other data. You will get the link for the data when you get the PowerPoint. So this is kind of one broad frame. Another broad frame to think about the role of immigrants in the American food system, as I said. The last count, this is before COVID-19, approximation of about 800,000 restaurants in the US. Most of you would know about things like McDonald's and Starbucks, but they are in fact not the most numerous. There are about 500,000 independent restaurants, most of them run by immigrants. And to give you an example, there are about 100,000 Italian restaurants. And look at the number of people who call themselves of Italian heritage in the US. That's 16 million. Keep that in view because that's going to be important. The next popular one is Chinese food in the US, and about 50,000 Chinese restaurants. But look at the number of people, only 5 million people. Okay, remember, we are talking out of about 320 million Americans today. Many of them voting today, including my son. The other important category of food that is available to Americans, popular, is about 45,000 Mexican American restaurants. But look at the number of people, 35 million people. It is the largest, one of the emerging minorities, and in fact comparable to German immigrants. I will talk about it at some point of time. And then here it is. The largest ethnicity in the US today is in fact German American. But German American restaurants, if you've ever visited the US, are almost never visible. They have mostly been either assimilated or in fact browbeaten, and I'm going to talk about it a bit about it, but they're visible in the big business, especially in the beer and wine business. If you look at the last names of any of the beer companies, by the way, that's both German and also tends to be Italian in some ways. Japanese American, very popular, about 14,000 restaurants, but only 1 million people are of Japanese heritage in the US. And in fact, most of Japanese restaurants in the US, like in most parts of the world, are not run by Japanese, are in fact run by other Asians, Chinese. And we will maybe get a chance to talk about it. So some ethnicities come into view, some others recede either due to ostracization or ubiquity. They're almost too inverted hypothesis, and I'm going to show you some data on that. The other group I was particularly interested, people like me, Indian Americans. There are about 4,000 Indian restaurants in the US, 5 million people. Look at the number. Look at that with the Chinese. Okay, there are about the same number of people, but look at the difference. Okay, the number of Chinese restaurants in the US is almost 12 times more than Indian restaurants in the US, although the number of people of that heritage in the country is about the same. Okay, so the popularity of a cuisine, look at the headline here. Population and popularity are not a one-to-one relationship. Okay, that's an important lesson to take. And Indian restaurants, a lot like Japanese restaurants, are in fact mostly not run by Indians, are run by Bangladeshi and Pakistanis from South Asia. There's a family of resemblances, and that is partly because of the nature of the migration, Indian migration in the US, which is often comes with Anglophone people like me with college degree who can find other jobs. If you find other jobs, you don't want to run a restaurant because it is a very thin profit margin restaurant. And then others like, say, Japanese, make visible a global kind of a visibility of what I call culinary soft power. And we will talk a little more detail about it. And I'll give you an example, a quick example of Italian food, which is kind of fascinating. Italian food was quite prestigious and popular in the US in very early on at the end of the 18th century and 19th century. They often had slightly Frenchified names like macaroni or parmesan, and Thomas Jefferson had made mac and cheese kind of quite visible. But what is interesting is, as poor Southern Italians started coming into the US, the prestige of Italian food began to collapse. Okay, that's one of my major theoretical points you will see, which is how the prestige of a cuisine is inversely related to the immigration of poor migrants coming from that country. And by the way, this is not just national, sorry, there's something declined here, not just international, not just Americans, but also in fact, Italians themselves had and this is the example from Carlo Lorenzini. He's a Tuscan, northern Italian author of Pinocchio, writing in 1886. The blackened aspect of toasted crust, the whitish sheen of garlic and anchovy, the greenish yellow tint of the oil and fried herbs, and those red bits of tomato here and there give pizza the appearance of complicated filth that matches the dirt of the vendor. This is northern Italians writing about southern Italian food, okay? So this is James Beard, some of you know, very famous American after whom we have the Beard Foundation. He said, my opinion of Italian cookery is not too high. It seems to me that even the food on the Wagon restaurant was better in France, he's talking about, than all the food of Italy. The opposite of it, of course, everybody in the US today, since about the 1980s, late 1980s, says how great Italian food is. It's the best food in the world. So the food, in fact, hasn't changed. Our relationship to the people have changed, okay? And I'll give you an example about German food. As I'm assuming at least some of you are of German heritage, 1873. And this is the New York Times writing. They serve odd things that foreigners love. Along with roasts and pumpkin pies, there's lentil soup in which masses of bologna sauces are floating, while another man is at work on something like fish balls smothered in red cabbage, all of which is served with an enormous supply of coarse German bread. Of course, what would be coarse German bread would become very good bread at the end of the century in terms of estimation. One customer orders a Wiener Schnitzel, a tremendous name, which, however, when brought is only the veal cutlet with the bone removed. Okay, there's this kind of, all this is, by the way, cheap food, about 15 cents at this point of time. And this writer in the New York Times says, when you look at further closely at German cuisine, it shows beef a la mode served with macaroni, a peculiar but highly satisfactory way of eating, clearly served by waiters who are clearly German. So, in fact, this is very typical of kind of foreign, poor immigrant food. There's a kind of an inviting exoticism and slight disdain that each new group of immigrant faces when it comes in. Eventually, we will see, of course, by 1945, in fact, German food almost totally vanishes from the discussion, and it is hidden, I say, in plain view. There are two kinds of things that are hidden in American culture. One is hidden because it's invisible, and the other is hidden because everyone does it. No one realizes they're doing German things, okay? And I'll give you an example here on data on conversations in the New York Times over about 140-year period. I'm going to draw your attention to two things. Look at the German data, and that's 1881, 1910. This is about 30-year data. And then it collapses. The next point is 1911 to 1940. And if you think about it, that's during the two world wars that collapse in conversation about German food, and it eventually vanishes by the end of the 20th century. I mean, if you come to the US today, you might get a caricature of a Bavarian beer garden, but hardly any real kind of German identified food in some ways. And look at the Italian on the other side. Conversations about Italian is it takes a bit of a hit early on, but it eventually begins to climb and really escalates at the end of the 20th century. There's a lot of discussion in American media about German beer gardens, how these are weird places because these are mostly Anglo men writing, Irish and British and Scottish writing about how German beer gardens are weird because there are women and children there, and how immoral those things are, because these are very different notions of what, in fact, a pub is in the Anglo imagination and what a beer garden is in terms of gender and generation. So in a sense, I'm talking about the curious case of vanishing German cuisine, where Germans are lost visibility over time, either because they become white Americans and or partly because of forced assimilation through the two world wars, where Germans are identified as the enemy. And a dramatic example is German language, which is the most important second language taught in American schools until Spanish becomes so in the late 1980s, is they stopped teaching German as an enemy language, especially in the upper Midwest. I jump from there to today in terms of contemporary popularity and prestige. I'm going to use the next kind of 10, 12 minutes to talk about this data. You see, my work is basically what I call long-term, large-scale change. I'm a historical sociologist. I look at data over a long period of time, and then I dig into some of this data. This data is from one survey, which is Zagat's. Over the last 30 years, I collected data about price. And what I'm pointing to here is, if price is a surrogate for prestige, what are some of the most prestigious American cuisines today? And if you look on the right-hand side, which is ranking in 2016, Zagat stopped collecting that data. The last data point is 2016, so that's why my data ends there. The most pricey American restaurants, for instance, in New York City was Japanese, then, which is surprising, but then predictably French, and then predictably American, especially New American. Then something in the US is called continental. Then you get Italian. The Italian is slightly misrepresentation here, because here you have data that includes pizza places. So it looks like it is falling in rank and prestige, but if you take the pizza places out, the prestige of Italian food has been climbing. The categories that have been climbing the most are the next ones. Spanish, especially Greek and Korean and Vietnamese, are climbing very fast. And if you have been eating, if you are listening to American talk about American foods, you will be listening to the New American, about the Italian American, about Spanish and Greek and Korean, amongst others. By the way, that was from Zagat's. Zagat's is much more middle brow. Yelp is much more popular. And on the couple of things I want to draw your attention to. The y-axis data is popularity. So the most popular cuisine in New York City is Italian. We have already know that data from the number of Italian restaurants. Then it is Chinese, then it is Mexican, then it is Seoul, and you can see it's going down. The second data point I want to draw your attention to is on the right-hand side, which is the green data with percentages linked to it. So if you look at Italian, 12% of Italian restaurants in New York City are expensive upscale restaurants. So remember my hypothesis: if price is a good surrogate for prestige, it shows you that Italian restaurants are doing quite well, very well in New York City. But they're not as prestigious as, you look down that column on the right side, you see New American, 24%, right? Frida, are you getting a headache from all this data? No? Okay. I saw your head. I said, good. And further below, you can see French. That's good. Further below is French, 27%. See that green? That is almost a global phenomenon. And I'll show you data now, interestingly, in other parts of the world. And just keep those things in mind. This is London. Predictably, the most popular food to eat out in London is Indian. Okay, next is Italian. But look at the number, the green number on Indian. About 12% of Indian restaurants in London are pricey or upscale. Remember this data? 12% of Italian restaurants in New York City are upscale. So my analogy is this. Indian food is to London what Italian food is to New York City. Okay, popularity and prestige in terms of a structure. Then you can dig down. Again, you look at in London, French, look at French. Half the French restaurants are upscale. Okay, there is kind of a declining but still French hegemony in the world, and the Japanese have joined, maybe the Nordics have joined a little. I'm going to show you some data from closer home to some of you. I went to give a talk in Frankfurt last year, so I collected the Yelp data, and for Frankfurt, it's the most popular is self-described German. By the way, all this is self-description. I'm not making a judgment whether this food is German or Italian. It is what the restaurants classify themselves as, okay, which is called nominalism, which is I take what people say seriously, just right there, okay? So German is top, then Italian, then Thai. You look at popularity. International was something interesting. I had not encountered that category until I went to Frankfurt. And as you can see, it's a upscale category. About 22% of international restaurants that call themselves international in Frankfurt are upscale. By the way, they took me to a place for dinner, which was called itself an international restaurant. So international means there will be a bit of Thai, there'll be a bit of Asian influence, there'll be a bit of Turkish influence, but upscale in some ways. And you can see the ranking down there. And I did the same just for fun's sake. Oh, by the way, I'll talk about it. The interesting thing, and this is more deeper ethnographic work, what I was intrigued when I went to Frankfurt were the very cool Turkish cafes in Frankfurt, and intersection of design, music, fazil, Turkish jazz, food, and mood. We do not see that, by the way, like say an analog would be, we do not see such interesting Mexican cafes, upscale cafes in American cities yet, especially New York City. We see a bit of it. And the question, of course, is, and now I'm going to leave you with some questions, which is it because, of course, one, there's a richer Turkish cafe culture than, say, a Mexican cafe culture. And the difference maybe in class structure of the two migration streams, where Mexican migration is a lot more working class in the US. Turkish migration is often left-wing Turks who have left in different cohorts for the long time, which is a much more cafe inhabiting political refugee culture and the longevity, especially of professional migration. And then I asked people, my friends around in Frankfurt, they said, this is relatively more recent in Frankfurt. This was probably more true in Berlin over a longer period of time. Is one of the arguments. This is ethnographic work, and I would depend on your kind of an insight to think about it. The last data point I want to point out is this Yelp data on Berlin. Remember, this is Anglophone Yelp data. So maybe it is talking only to outsiders, visitors, tourists. And you have to tell me what the conversation might be different if it was talking only to insiders. Look at the popularity. Unlike Frankfurt, the popularity of Italian is the highest in Berlin. And then it is German, and then you have American with burgers and Japanese sushi, kebabs, Indian, etc., etc. It goes down. Italian is quite prestigious, 22%. A quarter of German restaurants are upscale. A lot more cheaper American restaurants, burger joints, sushi joints, then of course kebab joints. Indian is popular, more popular, I'm surprised, than Chinese, by the way. I didn't realize that. I was surprised by that number, but about only 4% of Indian is upscale. Similarly, only 3% of Chinese is upscale, etc. You see my kind of a conversation about popularity and prestige. So this is the last slide I'm going to show you where I bring in this question of popularity and prestige of cuisines are not randomized. They exhibit patterns, okay? There's a hierarchy, what I call a hierarchy of taste. I'm probably known for that the most now. And that hierarchy changes over time related to class and racial formation. Okay. If price is a useful surrogate for prestige, then median price of a cuisine, it is inversely related to the current inflow of poor immigrants from that country. Once that flow subsides and there's upward mobility, prestige climbs, as has happened with Italian and Japanese cuisine, at least in the US. But there's also something else going on. There's a global circulation of soft power networks of professional prestige that has happened with Italian, Japanese, Nordic, Spanish chefs, maybe a few Mexican and a few Peruvian chefs today, but global process of peer review and in some ways critical acclaim, but by the way, excludes huge parts of the world. Out of world's top 50 most visible chefs, there's almost no one who's sub-Saharan African. There's almost no one who's South Asian, other than maybe Gagan in Bangkok. There's almost no one from mainland China. So that's about 3 billion people out there excluded out of this category of a global circulation of soft power. Then I'm also saying in the American case, there is, sorry, I'll see my slide. German and Irish are hidden in plain view, partly maybe due to repression and partly maybe due to ubiquity as American cuisine, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it. The hierarchy is different in different cities, yet there are some national and some regional patterns, okay? And I became known for a piece that The Atlantic did, a long piece on my book, The Ethnic Restaurateur, where they quoted me as saying the future is expensive Chinese food in the US. Why? For the same reason that I have studied for the last 150 years of data, the end of in-migration of poor Chinese as the economy takes off. Professional Chinese, most Chinese immigrants in major American cities are college students, are what are called expatriates. The difference between an expatriate and a migrant is simple. It's class. Okay, so white people, Asian people, when they migrate, they are called expatriates. If they don't have, if they're not working class people are called migrants, basically. And the rise of power of Chinese economy and prestige in terms of soft power. So my big hypothesis here is this. Sometimes judgments about food and good taste have very little to do with the food and a lot to do with our judgments about the class and color of the people involved. Okay, so today what I have done is giving you sense by way of popularity and prestige of cuisines and immigrant lives and livelihoods, a kind of a quick view of what the world looks like from New York City to me. And I've just brought in some preliminary data from Frankfurt and Berlin just because I'm talking at this event. So I thought it would be fun. This is my pandemic cooking, what my dinner table looks like. Books, food, flowers, and stuff on the windowsill. So let me stop and let me stop sharing so we can talk about it now.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for sharing your work. Are there already some questions? And if so, feel free to unmute or just post it into the chat. But Carla has already a question.
Okay, so where is Carla's question?
Carla, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. I have two questions. So I think I'm going to start with the maybe easier one. What are your thoughts on the concept of terroir?
Okay.
Yeah, that's my first question. And my second question is, so I was wondering, like, it's a question I'm asking myself on a lot of food products, but I'm wondering, how do you find the balance between celebrating a dish or celebrating some food without making it an exclusionary process, like without excluding communities or some classes of people by doing that?
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent questions. I'm going to say a few things. Of course, this in some ways is kind of my contemporary judgment. Some of it will change. So in fact, my work is almost the opposite of terroir. And my bigger argument is good food comes from two sources: roots, location, and transplantation, transportation, mobility. There's no food in the world that is totally local today. Has almost never been, probably. And I mean, even like say European cuisines in the medieval age, right, was highly spiced, spices, especially elite cuisine. So any cuisine, if you look at it close enough, right now I'm working on a project on an Indian Ocean cuisine and looking at the connection between the Swahili African coast and the west coast of Africa. Fascinating connection, including, of course, plants, biota, and then, of course, culture. So there's bananas, coconut. There's even the baobab tree. I didn't realize. I spent half my life in India. I left India until recently. I didn't realize in parts of India, baobab trees grow, which is from Africa. But the fruit of the baobab is used as, it's called manduki imli, which is like a tamarind. Okay, and this is, I'm just learning even the deep layers of connection. So this is in some ways about roots, but also about connected histories. I mean, think about, of course, potato, and think about tomatoes. Where would Italian food be without tomatoes? And rice, which is native to about 3 billion people. It spreads in various parts of Southeast Asia and from Africa, a particular kind of rice. And there's a repeated recirculation. So it's an ancient process of movement of people, animals, and plants. And good food is often an intersection between these two things: what grows locally and what has been brought from elsewhere by geography or by, in some ways, people's mobility. So this is the other side of terroir. We have to give a name, Carla, to it, like terroir, and would be part of this culture. But as soon as you have that, there's of course also this other question of your second question, which is between celebration and exclusion. And in the United States, it has gotten really overheated by this conversation around cultural appropriation, and which is an interesting conversation. I find it productive, meaning that it raises a very interesting question about culture and power. Okay, which elements and idioms of a culture get celebrated, when and how. In fact, a lot of my work, as you saw, is, for instance, how German food is considered poor people's food in the US. Then it gets absorbed into becomes American food with some changes and some differences. Italian food used to be considered disgusting, foreign, too much garlic. You should see Americans writing about Italian food. In the 1920s, 1930s, saying, "Oh my God, it is so garlicky. It provokes thirst for wine. That is why they drink wine, and they cook all this garlic in this filthy oil called olive oil. That is terrible. That is greasy. That is terrible for you." Of course, all that has flipped. 100 years later, we can't think of we don't think of Italian food as anything but the best food in the world. So this question of power and a cultural artifact, in this case of food. So what this cultural appropriation raises good questions about is how these things change over time. Or you can also inverse it. Think about the place I come from. I come from India, and the relationship between India and Great Britain is a peculiar relationship of colonialism, where we don't eat, as Indians, we don't eat British food, but we drink British drinks, including tea, by the way, which if you read Gandhi was berating Indians for drinking tea, because tea was in fact sold primarily by British tea gardens, okay? And that changes in the 20th century. And Indians drink British tea, I would say, in a very British style, with milk and sugar, etc. In China, little vessels called China, by the way. And Indians also drink whiskey, and a lot of. But Indians don't eat that much British food, and the British are opposite. they eat a lot more Indian food. As you saw in London, the most popular cuisine is Indian. So in fact, the relationship between empire and food may sometimes be how the empire strikes back.